This show is about your mental health. While it's supported by the pillars of positivity and hope, if you find yourself in crisis, please reach out for help. In many communities in both the United States and Canada, you can dial 211 to be connected to mental health and crisis services in your region. While it may seem like it at times, you are not alone. Suicide is a final, fateful choice. At the time, those who know say it seems like the only choice. In the last few months of lockdown, crisis lines have been overwhelmed by those saying they just don't want to live anymore. Just the thought of suicide or suicide ideation in people has increased exponentially. Ignoring it, hiding it, doing nothing, these are not answers. Suicide. Let's talk about it right now on The Happy Molecule. Hello, this is The Happy Molecule. I'm Kevin Frankish. It's a podcast aimed at improving your mental health. His name was Paul. He was 24 years old from Toronto. He spent his life struggling with demons, saved from a toxic family. He couldn't stop the hurt from following him through his life. He still turned to a bottle or worse from time to time, but he had support. And all those around him who tried to get him help felt he was finally in a much better place. This past Christmas Eve, in fact, he texted a good friend, "Miss you. See you soon." A few hours later, his body would be found in his bedroom. 2002, another young man, Mark Henick, stood on the edge of a bridge in Sydney, Nova Scotia. One voice from a small crowd that had gathered shouted, "Jump, you coward!" And that seemed to confirm for him that he indeed had only one choice. And as he moved forward to step that final step, a stranger in a brown coat, who actually earlier had started a conversation with him, reached out his arms and pulled him back. Well, like Paul, Mark honestly felt this was indeed his only choice. Today, Mark Henick has written a book, So-Called Normal. He runs a company that teaches suicide prevention. He has become the stranger he encountered that night in Sydney, reaching out from the dark to save a life, and he has saved many. Hello, Mark. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Kevin. I'm happy to be here.
You have an incredibly compelling story, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But first of all, I want to talk about the present and what you are doing now. You are the CEO of Strategic Mental Health Solutions. What is that?
So lately, the last few years, I've been focusing on media advocacy primarily, talking and starting conversations about mental health in a variety of different environments. I've been spending a considerable amount of time, or a considerable portion of that, in workplaces across Canada and in fact around the world, not only raising awareness of mental health. I think we're doing a good job of that, a relatively good job of that in many workplaces now, but actually helping them to develop some strategies, some solutions for what do we do next? Okay, we're aware, great, what now? I think that's where many companies, and indeed that's where we are as a society, continuing to stumble, is what do we do now? So that's what I try to help people do, and that's what I've been, I've dedicated my life to mental health work because I have no other transferable skills. This is all I know how to do.
It sounds familiar. Yeah, and the reason I wanted to bring that up first is because I want to talk a little bit about this burgeoning industry that is mental health, because you know and I know that we were already facing an incredible mental health crisis before COVID, but still the stigma was there and it was something we don't talk about. Now it has grown exponentially, and we're going to see more companies like yours and more people coming into the industry of mental health and trying to improve mental health.
I think so. And, I've certainly seen an evolution over the years. After I did my TEDx talk in 2013 and that went viral, I signed with a speaking agency and I started getting booked for events. And I had been speaking about my own personal lived experience since high school. I remember the very first time I wanted to speak openly about my depression and anxiety and my suicide attempts. I asked the principal of my high school if I could do that, and he said no.
Wow.
That if you talk about suicide, it gives people the idea to go out and do it, as though they had never thought of it before. I knew then that that wasn't true, and there is a right way and a wrong way to talk talk about suicide, a safe way and an unsafe way. But I knew that we needed to talk about it because people told me all the time about their struggles privately, and I knew that it was the silence that was killing them. So from that moment to now, I think we've made great strides in that awareness, and it has helped people to reach out, but we still have a long way to go.
Yeah, and it's interesting you should mention that, because there were times I would try and bring suicide up on the air, and I would get admonished for doing that by producers or other managers. I once had a doctor contact me from a hospital saying, "You're just going to create copycats." But I agree with you. There is a right way and a wrong way. But at the same time, if we don't talk about it, and by the way, it has been proven that talking about suicide does not create copycats. I want to make that very clear. Right. But it opens up an avenue for people who feel they're alone to say, wait a minute, you mean other people may feel this way?
Right. Now, the research on copycat suicides is fuzzy in some ways. Mm-hmm. There does seem to be some correlation between inappropriate reporting on suicide, for example, sensationalist or romanticizing the suicide, or wall-to-wall coverage. You know, on this point, I think about the comparison between how the death of Kurt Cobain was reported in the 90s when he died by suicide, compared to the reporting on when Robin Williams died by suicide, or Anthony Bourdain, or Kate Spade. There was definitely still a lot of reporting, especially around Robin Williams, but it was a different type of reporting. And there was a moment when that happened that this really clicked for me, that things were changing, when one of the major news outlets in the United States sent a helicopter to have a live feed from over Robin Williams' house. And within the hour, I think it was, there was outrage on social media. That this was not only an invasion of their privacy, but it was in fact dangerous. It was that kind of sensationalization of the suicide that could in fact lead to a contagion effect. On the credit of that news agency, they pulled the helicopter right away, and they changed their coverage as a result of that. That didn't happen in the case of Kurt Cobain, and we did see a bubble at that time. So, you know, I think that the right way to talk about suicide in a public forum, in a way that is constructive and gets people help, is to set it in context, to remind people that there's very often mental illness present, especially depression. There are very often other factors present as well, socioeconomic factors in particular. And to leave people with a message of hope and inspiration, that nobody has to die by suicide, that it's always a tragedy, and we can and should be doing a better job of preventing it.
You are already doing something that has changed over the last decade or so, and people may not even have noticed. Do you know what I'm referring to by chance?
No, my hair? No.
No, it's lovely.
It's a lot longer now.
No, how you are referring to die by suicide rather than to commit suicide. Tell me about that.
So I said that this actually goes right to the root of why I wanted to do the TEDx Toronto talk back in 2013. It started, as many of my initiatives do, with me just being kind of irritated about something. And I think many creative people are kind of like this too. Something just niggles at the back of your brain somewhere, something bothers you, and you respond to it. So for me, I was working as a clinician at the Canadian Mental Health Association. I was working in a program that supported 16 to 24-year-old youth who were dealing with mental health problems and illnesses. Just as an aside, I much later realized that I was trying to be the person that I needed at that age, I think. But in the course of that, I was scrolling through the Wikipedia page for suicide and just reading what they had, some of the research that they had been including in the Wikipedia page. And I noticed that throughout the page, there was commit suicide, commit suicide, commit suicide. And there were references to to people who have failed attempts. In other words, they don't complete their attempt. Through my work with the Mental Health Commission of Canada on their board for years, through my work as a clinician, my education.
And by the way, you were the youngest president of a provincial Canadian mental health association in history.
I was, yeah. Like I said, I've been doing this for my entire professional career, and it really started there at the community mental health level. And in that context, everybody knows that suicide isn't a crime. And when you talk about, would you use language of commit, people commit murder, they commit arson, they commit rape. They don't commit suicide because suicide hasn't been a crime in Canada since the 70s. And it's not a crime in many jurisdictions around the world. So the language was factually incorrect. When I made those edits to Wikipedia, though, to try to be both grammatically correct and factually correct, I was met with a community very resistant to that change. You know, they said in the little talk page behind the Wikipedia page where people discuss what the content will be, they said, but it's not the common way of saying it. Well, truth doesn't have to be common. Correct doesn't have to be common. The right way to talk about suicide is dying by suicide, and that's what an online encyclopedia should be. So I lost that argument. They didn't include the edits in that article. And part of the reason for that was because that there weren't enough sources out there to support my position that the proper way to refer to a suicide is death by suicide. So I had become the type of person over the years that if something doesn't exist, then build it. So I happened to see one of my friends had posted the nominations for this TEDx Toronto thing. I applied partly out of irritation that I needed to make a talk and put a talk out there that addressed this point of why we don't say commit suicide anymore, why we should be saying die by suicide. I was accepted into it. We did the talk, and then the rest is history. It goes on to go viral all around the world. And now I hope, a lot more people know that distinction, that suicide is not a crime. It's a public health disaster in many ways, but it's one that calls for healthcare, not for a punitive type system.
Let's get back to that talk then. So this is 2013. How old were you in 2013?
What's the reverse math? I don't know. 23.
It's 7 years ago.
Something like that. I don't know.
7 years ago, Mark.
Whatever. I'm a writer and a speaker, not some fancy mathematician who can count 7.
How old are you now, Mark?
33 now. I hardly even remember that.
Take away this. So that's you were 20. You were 26. Okay. Okay. So you were 26. You went to do this TEDx talk in Toronto. It's been viewed millions of times, by the way. What was the talk was about you as well. So pick up the story there.
Yeah, it was. So I wanted to, and this is really what I've done. I've refined it greatly over the years. And I'm one of those people that whenever I watch my own work, I'm my biggest critic, I think. So I don't think it actually, in retrospect, was my finest piece of public speaking that I've ever done. But it did seem to connect with a ton of people because I went out onto the stage and I shared 2 stories about some of the most vulnerable times in my life when I was actively suicidal. I kind of bookended the stories. The first one that I tell was one of my very first suicide attempts. The second story that I tell ended up being my last, although I didn't know it was going to be my last until much, much later. And I talk about some of these things that I'd learned both through my education and through working in community mental health advocacy about mental health. It turns out, I think, and this happens when there's a relative void of information, when there's just not enough people being that real, that honest with people, is that it really struck a chord that it turned out people from all over the world had felt what I felt, or very similar feelings when I recounted the story of climbing over the railing of a bridge ready to end my life, and then the stranger who saved my life. If it wasn't for that TEDx talk, I actually never would have found out who that stranger was.
You found out that person.
We did. So this was actually after the
I'm getting a bit of ahead of myself here. So I want to get back to that.
Sure.
Let's talk about that first attempt. What happened? What were you feeling?
I now realize that at the very early stages, I think and this isn't uncommon, my suicidality, my depression, my social anxiety disorder that I was diagnosed with at the time, it started well before my first suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. Through the course of writing my book, I was able to actually track, because I pulled all my medical records and my school records, and I was able to track when the symptoms started to really happen, kind of as an objective observer. And I now know that I probably started experiencing formal symptoms of depression and anxiety as young as about 10 years old. And then by the time I was 12.
Why do you know that it was 10 years old? What was in your record? What happened?
Yeah, and these aren't discrete timelines by any means. I think they fade into one another. But when I looked back at the declines in my grades, the transitions that I was experiencing at the time, my father left when I was very young, and then we moved in with my stepfather, and that turned out to be an incredibly emotionally abusive relationship and situation. I was routinely received the message that I had to be a man, even though at that time, I was 8 years old when we moved in. I was just a little boy, but I was told that boys don't cry, that I had to be a man, I had to suck it up, I can't express any emotion. So then by the time I get to about 10 years old, when my grades are starting to tank, I'm starting to withdraw more. I'm feeling, all these things inside that I'm not allowed to express. They say that depression is hate turned inward. And I think that's what happened. I couldn't express these things outward, so it started to collapse inward in on me. And this is one of the concepts, I think probably the core concept of my TED Talk that people really grabbed onto was this idea of the collapse, this perceptual collapse that happens inside your mind, inside your psyche when you're extremely depressed and becoming suicidal. Everything just gets tighter and darker and more rigid until there's only this one point where you think you need to die in order to escape. And it doesn't matter if there are other options because you can't see them, because you've been so collapsed in this survival mode with the blinders on that seems like the only option. I think that was happening to me through, from the ages of 10 to 12 until I actually did start expressing suicidal ideation when I was 12 years old.
Your first thoughts of suicide to the first attempt, how long was that? What ages?
Not very long. So I think, late 12 years old to early 13 years old. So it progressed fairly quickly once the first domino fell. I've kind of likened it to a downward spiral, or I say in the book, circling the drain, that there's this iterative effect to my depression and anxiety and suicidality. So the very first time I was in a fight with my stepfather that morning, I've come to think of these as kind of as trivial triggers, that when you've got all this pressure built up inside you, sometimes it doesn't take very much to push that first domino or to prick that balloon, because you're already so raw and emotional. So it was a disagreement with my stepfather. I got to school late that day. I had missed most of the period in which I was supposed to be writing a social studies test. And then for whatever reason, I had started to dissociate in my mind anyway, which is where that's your mind's way of protecting you from a painful present, is that it makes your mind just float away somewhere else. It's your brain's way of saying, this is too much for me right now, you can stay, but I'm going to head out for a bit. That's your brain's way of protecting you. And that had started to happen to me anyway. So I would have these moments where I wouldn't remember where I was, or I couldn't remember, studying for the test, which I had, because I had previously identified as a pretty smart kid. So I remember sitting down at my desk, having absolutely nothing in my head, just being completely blank. And then, like on autopilot, I drew 10 little pictures in the margins of the blank test that I couldn't remember any of the answers to. And they turned out to be 10 different ways that I could end my life. And that was the very first time that the thoughts that I think had been swirling around in some form in my head for at least 2 years by that point, that was the very first time they came out of my head and into the world, was that when I drew those little pictures on my test.
If 2020 Mark could go back and talk to young Mark, I'm gonna ask you what you would say at two different points. One, the first time when you sat down and you were drawing those pictures, and then maybe talking to Mark at the moment where you felt there was no other choice. Yeah. What do you know now? What have you learned that you could say to young Mark?
This is something that I've thought about this a lot. This is something that I think I'm not sure I would have listened to me then. I wouldn't listen to present day me. But if I could communicate to that young man, to that kid, little boy, anything, it might be that, yeah, this is gonna suck. This is really hard. And that might sound like a strange thing to say to a little kid, but I think what I wanted more than anything was somebody to validate the feelings that I was feeling. that it wasn't meaningless, it wasn't trivial, that this little test might seem insignificant to everybody else, but this was my whole world. And I felt like a failure. I felt stupid. I felt useless. I felt hopeless and helpless increasingly, which is the toxic mix for suicidality. So I think I would validate myself that this is really hard, and I'm sorry that it's so hard. You've been through so much, but it won't always be this way. I think that's what I would want the older me to know, that it won't always be this hard.
That's powerful. That's very powerful, because I think we all need to be told that, whether or not we have thoughts of taking our own life or just simply have thoughts of depression, that, it's not always going to be this hard. But you hit a wall, don't you? You hit a wall, and you can't see beyond that wall, and you're just saying, I've got no other choice right now.
Yeah, because I think suicide isn't about ending your life. People don't attempt or die by suicide because they want to die necessarily. I mean, I'm sure that there are probably a small number that are that. But in the vast majority of cases, in people that I've talked to, that I've counseled, that have connected with me as a result of the TED Talk, people just don't want to keep struggling. They can't carry that weight anymore. I was raised in a Newfoundland version of Irish Catholicism, where it was very common to hear that maybe this is just my cross to bear. Well, I didn't want to bear this cross. I'm not the Christ. I had a dream about that once, where I had this demon speak to me. It's a scene in the book, actually. I was in junior high school, I think, and I'm trapped on a school bus that just drives up and down the same road over and over again. And then this demon turns around and says to me, "You are not the Christ." I felt like I had to be the Messiah if I was ever going to carry this burden, because I felt like there was nobody else there who could even see the burden that I was carrying, let alone help me carry it.
What happened? What went wrong? From the time you were 10 years old, how did, and I don't want to just generalize and say society, but how did we fail you? How did we fail young Mark?
Well, I think there's a combination of factors here. One is that, my mother worked in the healthcare system for 30 years as a nurse, but she wasn't a nurse at home. She wasn't a healthcare provider at home. She was a parent. And I think that parents, both of that time and now, just don't have the tools that they need. They're not raised often, even talking about their own emotions. So as a result, I tell people this all the time, little kids are born with feelings just by default. They're born with often strong feelings, but they're not born with the words for those feelings. That's something that you have to learn later on, that you apply labels to all the stuff that's happening in you. If your parents don't know how to do that, if your teachers don't know how to do that in an intentional, explicit, overt way, then you're just going to pick it up as you go by watching how other people manage their emotions or don't. And that's how I think depression and anxiety and mental illnesses can be intergenerational, that you pick up the things that you see around you. So I think that's one of the first failures that we're still consistently replicating, is that we're not recognizing those very early, most basic skills in terms of naming and labeling your emotions and then dealing with them. That's as just about as far upstream as we can go, that later can prevent suicide and severe and persistent mental illness, because we can divert so many people from ever going down that road. There are programs already that exist that help people do this. This isn't rocket science, but for some reason, we're still not getting our act together and teaching emotional literacy in an effective way in schools and with parents and in all aspects of society, workplaces especially.
I'm talking with Mark Henick. He is the principal and CEO of Strategic Mental Health Solutions. They're a consulting firm that specializes in helping organizations and individuals move from basic mental health awareness towards meaningful, measurable action. He's also a TED Talker, and you have a book coming up. The book is called So-Called Normal, a memoir of family depression and resilience, HarperCollins, coming out in January. That book, I guess, is sort of like you said before, the TED Talk was sort of done on a whim, and since then you have refined and refined and refined. So this is the product of 7 years of talking about this.
Yeah. I mean, it's really the product of my entire life. When I got the book deal originally, and I think I'd been tossing it around in my mind for ages, but when I finally got the book deal, it kind of just languished on the side of my desk for a while. I was, I had a high-ranking position within a national mental health charity, and then eventually I just came to the realization that this is what I need to do. This is what I'm being called to do, is to write this book. So I took a risk. I left that job, didn't really know what I was gonna do, and I wrote the book. I went away to a Trappist monastery in the woods for more than a month, and I wrote the first draft of that. I had to do this. I had to take this seriously.
You did not go to a Trappist monastery.
I did, and I went back several times, actually.
Wow.
Yeah, so I went and I took it seriously. I think I can be a bit much. I can be a bit intense. So I go all in on these things. I lived with these monks for more than a month. I went and chanted with them 5 times a day, and I wrote for 10 hours a day every day for a month. I went deep into this book. I shared a couple of pictures while I was doing that first draft, just to Instagram and stuff. I didn't really do much social media during that time, but every now and then I'd pop in to let people know that, I'm okay. I'm just delving deep into recesses of my psyche here, but everything is good. And it was such an extraordinary experience to go back and read what my doctors wrote about me, and read all these documents that I had never seen before. And then most importantly, I think, to see the narrative that nobody else saw at the time, to see logically, oh yeah, of course that happened the way that it did. If you actually look at all the medical records laid out in front of you, it made perfect sense.
How easy was it to get these records, your school records, your health records? Because I think right now, it's almost like I'm thinking to myself, perhaps one of the best therapies you could do is pretend to write a book on your life and do some research on yourself.
It's not for the faint of heart. I will say that when I should say that when I went into this process, part of the reason why I needed to go away and just delve, like Dante descending into the inferno, I had to just go all in on it, was that I needed to do it safely. I needed to know that if I'm going to go in and re-experience these emotions, and I very much did, that I needed to know that I could keep walking through it and eventually come out the other side in a way that I had never done before. Not everybody is ready to do that yet. It's not easy to do either. But I think that if you can set up your situation well enough to be able to do it, it was by far one of the most transformative experiences for me, because I got to choose the narrative that I got to make my story make sense, which is incredibly liberating when you realize that nobody else can tell you what your story is, that you get to take all the separate pieces and put them together and find the thread. That's what identity is finding the meaning in your life. It was absolutely extraordinary for me.
You put a disclaimer on your life. You just sort of said, warning, some of the scenes may be disturbing to some viewers.
Yeah. Well, and they can be, but this comes back to that point of context, that people's struggle doesn't happen for no reason. I really believe that. And I'm not, you might apply some supernatural or religious meaning to that, but for others, it's that everything takes on meaning in relative context to everything else, that there's a connection between everything. And if there isn't, then we create a connection between things. And that's what I was able to see in writing the book. And a lot of it is really hard, but it's real. And I wouldn't be who I am if not for who I was.
Now, this caveat you give about being careful about, do you really want to read this and say this? It's vital, it's important. However, when I was posing the question about how easy it was, although I'm glad you said that, I want to know how easy it was to get your own records from doctors, from schools.
So that was an interesting journey. The medical records actually really weren't that difficult at all. I think that there was my mother at the time was a bit hesitant for me to do that, but I think her primary worry was that she didn't want me to dig up all this stuff again, which, that wasn't completely unfounded, because had I not done it the way that I did, I very easily could have slipped back into that place again. Although I think I'm a different person now than the person I read about in those notes, so that helped a lot too. So the medical records were fairly easy to get. Back when, after I did the TED Talk and I had the urge to find this stranger that I talk about in the TED Talk who saved my life, I applied to have my police records released, because every time I attempted suicide and a variety of my other crises, police were called because there was nobody else to call. So I thought, okay, surely then there would be records of this. And particularly for this stranger who literally pulled me off a bridge one night, there were tons of police who had arrived. Surely he would have given a report and somebody would have put down his name. It turned out that the police don't like having their records read because they declined my initial request, and they declined it on a bunch of, they threw in a bunch of references to I think the Youth Criminal Justice Act and privacy laws.
Yeah, privacy from yourself.
Well, this was just it. So this was it. They said they can't disclose the records because it deals with a minor. And I wrote them a strongly worded letter back and said, I am the minor.
Yes.
And it actually says in the law, thank you, lawyer Google, because it's not hard to find. You read the law, it says, unless it's about the person who's making the request. So I sent that back to them. They didn't answer, or they declined it again. I went to a Freedom of Information Act request. I appealed it. The adjudicator very clearly sided with me, said, yeah, obviously these are his records and he can have them. So they eventually sent them to me. It didn't even matter by the end anymore because I had already, by this point, found other ways of finding that stranger. But just to close the loop on that story, they eventually did send me the records. There was no reference.
Please turn off all cell phones, ladies and gentlemen, during the show.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So, just to close the loop on that story, they eventually did send me the records. There was no reference whatsoever to this guy who saved my life, who pulled me off the edge of a bridge, which I thought was a bit curious. And there were also, interestingly, very clearly records missing, because I had my medical records. I had records from the emergency room in which the police brought me there, but then they didn't have a matching police record of that same date in the medical records. So I knew that the police weren't being forthcoming with my records. I don't know why. I don't know what was in there, and maybe I'll never know. But at the end of the day, I was able to piece my story together based on a variety of different sources, in addition to people who were there and who shared their stories with me too.
But
I'm not a journalist, like yourself, but it was a nice taste of it, I think, for me, of investigative journalism in my own life.
What about school records?
School records I was able to pull as well, and to be able to see the struggles that my teachers had, with me, and then a fear. One of the teachers had said, I included this in the book, after a spate of hospitalizations. I think I was in the hospital 3 times in 3 months or something like that, like 3 quick hospitalizations. And one of the teachers expressed a concern, if Mark goes to the bathroom during class and he doesn't come back in 5 minutes or 10 minutes, what do we do?
Wow.
That's how scared they were, that we don't know if he just left or killed himself or did something else. So I think I came to an appreciation through writing the book that I never really had before, the unintentional but still very present collateral damage that I was having on people who cared about me. And there's a certain guilt, I think, in having that discussion, but it's also very real. It's something that caregivers know, that it's exhausting to care for somebody who has a mental illness.
We're going to talk about the stranger. But you know what, folks? I'm going to keep it to the end to keep you listening. Right now, though, I want to get to the Me 3. 1, 2, 3. The Me 3, a chance for my guests to come up with just 3 very simple things that you can do to improve your mental health. 3 simple things that my guests have learned through their experience. And I'm very interested to see what you've come up with for your Me 3. What's your first one?
Notice. You have to notice what you're feeling. Notice your internal state at any given time. And you know what? Even I do this myself. If you have a watch with an alarm or on your phone or whatever, set a reminder, multiple reminders throughout the day, or tie a string on your finger or whatever it is that helps you to remember things at random times. Just to check in really quickly, literally takes 5 seconds. What am I feeling right now? And how am I dealing with it? And then that's it. Leave it go.
I love that idea.
The more you do it, the more you learn to actually check in with yourself and notice what you're feeling. That is a key, fundamental, core skill in both helping yourself through difficult times, but especially in maintaining good mental health.
Yeah, and I mean, it doesn't take any time at all, really. You're just asking you. We keep talking about being present, and it's an important step in good mental health, but we never seem to have time for it. But if we set an alarm and it says just be in the present moment for now, even if it's just for 1 second, what do I feel? What do I see? What do I smell? What do I hear? Okay, now I can move on with my day instead of saying, I'll do that later.
And it doesn't even have to be a big meditation or a big thing, or it's just literally, I'm feeling anxious right now. I'm feeling stressed right now. Or even more importantly, and this is a key piece, I think, I'm feeling really happy right now. I think so often we have this tendency to just ignore our happiness and assume that that's the way that it's supposed to be, that that's normal, that that's default, therefore we shouldn't pay attention to it. And we only pay attention to our strong, difficult emotions, our anger, our depression, our sadness, whatever it is.
Our anxiety, our worrying about...
However, the result of that, however, is that it reinforces the negative stuff. And then since you're not reinforcing the positive stuff, that muscle in your mind doesn't grow. So you need to be able to notice, especially the good things, the positive feelings as well.
Number 2.
When you notice those positive feelings in particular, amplify them, spend time with them, enjoy them. You know, that amplification of the positive emotions that you notice, you need to do that because you need to give your mind a break. If you don't, I tell people this all the time, you're going through a really stressful time in your life, or you're just carrying a lot of really difficult emotions. If you don't stop yourself, your body, your mind will stop you. It's this way of regaining equilibrium, that your brain has this evolutionary imperative to keep itself alive. That's almost its only function, is to keep itself alive. So in order to do that, it needs sleep, it needs food, it needs to be able to reset itself, to clean itself out, that it can't always be in this hyper-stressful place. One of the ways that we can do that is by practicing gratitude, by noticing and amplifying the good things that we have, because that gives our brain a little break from being so stressed out all the time. Don't worry, your stress will still be there waiting for you later. You can come back to it, but you can put it in a little box in your mind, put it over here for a minute, and then just enjoy your day. It can be incredibly therapeutic.
It is a great suggestion, but I want to tell you why it scares me. And I'm going to share a little story with you about that. So I do try and actually practice that. But I've noticed that when I do, it almost comes to me like, you know, that caffeine high you get if you haven't eaten. It comes to me in that way. And I finally figured, and it's not a good feeling. So if I'm happy and I'm reflecting on that and amplifying that, I've realized that I don't allow myself to be happy. And
you're not Irish Catholic.
Catholic, yes. So yeah, exactly, my friend. I have original sin on my shoulders.
So this is such a good point that I think, and I see this all the time. I experience this with treatment-resistant depression, with long-term depression. I until very recently was still undergoing treatment for depression. So I didn't have some hallelujah moment when that man saved my life. I still struggled for most of my life. In fact, I've had depression for longer than I haven't in my life. But the reason why I mention that is that when you start to experience happiness, if you do pay attention to it, sometimes there's these feelings of guilt. You know, I shouldn't feel this way. I don't deserve to be this happy. Yes, you do. Why don't you? Everybody deserves to be happy.
That is something and it's sad, but I have to convince myself of that.
And that, I think, is good information. All behavior, all thoughts, all feelings are information. It's data. If you feel guilty or hesitant or that you don't want to, for whatever reason, engage that happiness, that tells me that that's exactly what you need to be doing more of. That because that's a weak mental muscle or an underdeveloped mental muscle. the better you get at it, the more natural it becomes. Just like exercising at the gym, it kind of hurts at first. It's difficult at first, but you add more complexity, more weight to it, and the better and stronger you get. It's the exact same thing with your emotional fitness as well. The more you practice joy, practice gratitude, it's hard at first, but the better it gets, the stronger it gets, and the more rewarding it gets as well.
All right, number 3.
I think it's important to connect what you're feeling, especially in those joyful moments, to all the things that are happening around you at the time. This is a little more complicated, so I'm going to explain what I mean in terms of this connection process. You're feeling good for whatever reason. You don't have to judge it. There's no particular reason why, but you're feeling really good. Take a moment when you're feeling in that really good place, like you're really on. Notice the temperature in the air, the light, the way the light comes through the window. Notice the different smells, the different sensations, even the different objects that are around you in the room at the time. Why that's important to do, we know from conditioning, from decades of research on conditioning, is that you're then potentially creating associations with other seemingly neutral stimuli around you at the time. Now, does that mean that you're going to see the garbage can that's sitting next to you and it's going to spark joy or trigger happiness? Well, no, probably not. But the cumulative effect of associating all these neutral things with that positive emotion, the more you practice it, the more you'll notice that it'll start to elevate your mood. Because it comes back to that point that when you're depressed, in particular, if you're going to the extreme end or the clinical end, when you're depressed and anxious, we know that your brain is scanning the world, your attention is skewed to all the things that can go wrong. You're scanning the world for threats, you're looking at the world more negatively. The only way to counteract that is to practice looking at the opposite. That trains your brain through neuroplasticity, through cognitive restructuring, to actually reverse the course, to change your attention. Sean Acker has a wonderful TED talk on happiness, in which he talks about this too. You practice gratitude for three things that you're grateful for every day for 30 days. And research has shown that by the end of that 30 days, your brain starts to get used to it, to scanning the world to look for things to be grateful for. Does that mean that depressed people are ungrateful for things? No, of course not. It just means we need more practice and we can become better at finding things to be grateful for. And what's better than the feeling of gratitude? I mean, come on, feeling that you're either blessed or that you're deserving, that you're worthy. That's just everybody can and should feel that, and you can prime yourself to feel those emotions.
And it's funny you use the word opposite, because what hits me is that with my anxiety and my depression, I can be sitting in a chair or something, and I'm just feeling anxious, and I'm feeling that the anxiety. I don't know why. There's no particular reason until I start to, and I try and track down where my anxiety comes from. And sometimes it can take me 3 or 4 minutes of tracking down, okay, I did this, I did that, I thought about this. And then you realize it was something really small, but you're still anxious about it. But
one of those trivial triggers.
Yeah, but even though I'm not still thinking about that residue carried through, and I knew I had to be anxious and stressed, but I didn't know why, but I just knew I had to be. So,
and there's 2 things happening here. One is the spiral or the chain. I noticed this with the book too, that memories are sticky. It's like a barrel of monkeys. One seemingly meaningless thing happens, and then it pulls out this other thing, and then this other thing, and then this other thing, until suddenly you're way down on something else that didn't even have anything to do with the original trigger, and you're in that shame spiral or that anxiety spiral. One of the ways that I like to use to break out of that is that I take those same 3 things that I just mentioned, noticing your feelings, amplifying the good ones, and connecting the good ones with other neutral stimuli in your environment. At that second point, when you're having that, you notice those negative feelings, what's usually happening there is that you're clinging to them for whatever reason. That it's trying, those negative feelings serve a function. They're trying to do something, they're trying to express something. But sometimes our cognitive habits are such that we chase them. We chase that dragon all the way down the spiral until we feel way worse at the end than we did at the beginning. So instead, rather than amplifying the negative, we can actually just let it be. This goes back to the advice that I would give to my little kid self. it's okay for things to suck. It's okay to feel anxious. It's okay to feel terrible. Just let it feel terrible. You don't have to cling to it. You don't have to give it meaning. You don't have to fix it. You don't have to chase it. Just let it be, hold it lightly, and let it leave you too. I think that so often we cling to the negativity because we think we need it. We cling to our own depression in this weird kind of master-slave dialectic. We think that we need it. We don't. And we can release it from us. Now, easier said than done. It takes a whole lot of practice, but that's where it starts. Noticing the negative emotion, letting it be negative, and then we practice this thing from dialectical behavior therapy and mindfulness and a number of other traditions of acceptance and change. Yes, I accept this negative emotion. Now I can let it leave me. I think that's a very powerful skill for dealing with negative emotion.
All right, let's get to the stranger here. So you were thinking about taking your own life.
I was actively in the process of taking my own life, yeah.
And tell me what happened with this stranger.
I had climbed over the railing of a bridge in my hometown in Sydney, Nova Scotia. It was an overpass that stretched over the property of an old steel plant. And why I mention that, because I now realize how significant that place was for me. And I think it was because when I looked out over this old steel plant, this used to be the industrial capital of the Eastern Seaboard. They used to produce steel during both World Wars for the entire Eastern Seaboard, for the war effort. But by the time I was growing up, the plant was still there, but it was mostly shut down. It was mostly abandoned. It was collapsing and falling down. It's one of the worst toxic waste sites in North America. And I realized that as I looked out over that property, that abandoned, toxic property, it's exactly how I felt inside. And I felt like I didn't have any person who really understood that, but this place understood me. And I had talked to so many doctors over the course of the couple of years that it took to get to that inch and a half or so of concrete that I was standing on over the ground, ready to kill myself, that I felt like if all these smart people, these psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers, and if all these smart people can't help me, then maybe it means I'm unhelpable. Maybe I'm not fixable. Maybe I'm just one of those unlucky few who are cursed with this thing for the rest of my life. As I was spiraling down that pathway of thoughts, that process of spiraling that I mentioned, or that collapse, I was interrupted by a man's voice over my shoulder, and I don't remember him arriving or hearing him, stop his car behind me or anything like that, because I was so hyper focused, collapsed in this place. He just walked up behind me, and in a very Cape Breton way, is the way I think of it, he said, "You don't look like you're doing so good there." And I was on an inch and a half of concrete, 30 feet probably above the ground. It's 15 years old. It was almost midnight on a Sunday night in March. It was cold, I remember. And what I remember most about that stranger who came up behind me, I couldn't see him because the way that I was holding the railing behind me. I had glanced behind and I saw that he was wearing a light brown jacket all the time. That's all, or at the time, that's all I could remember. But what I do remember about what he said to me was that he didn't sound like one of these dozens of health professionals that I had talked to over the years. I had been through the revolving door of the hospital so many times. I was one of those kids that the more help they need, the less help they get. Mm-hmm. I'd become a frequent flyer by that point, where I just got kind of written off, I felt like. But this guy didn't sound like any of those people, because he didn't ask me about my diagnosis, or he didn't ask me about my medication or my therapy or my symptoms or any of that stuff. He just talked to me, I think, about my cat, about my hobbies and my family and my interests and my friends and what I like to do, the stuff that I was passionate about. It was just a regular conversation, but it was so unusual for me, both I think in that circumstance and just generally in my life, to have somebody who seemed to be genuinely interested in getting to know me. I think that's really what kept me on that edge for longer than I wanted to be, because I was having this conversation, even though he was doing most of the talking. Until then, as my perception relaxed a little bit, I realized that the police had arrived. They had set up barricades on either side of the bridge, and crowds had gathered at either side of the barricade, because in small towns, you listen to the police scanner to see if there's any action happening that you can go check out. And I think that's what happened there.
And you managed to track him down.
I did. So after the police had arrived at that night on the bridge, among the crowds, there's a group of young men. And I was never sure if it was kind of the out-of-tune radio sound that was always happening in my head or if it was real, but I could swear to this day that one of them shouted out to me to jump, and he called me a coward. And when that guy on the sideline said that, I let go of the railing and I started to fall, because that was that trigger, right? That was that, this is why I don't want to be here, because of people like that who are so unconcerned with connecting with people. It didn't matter that I had the stranger in the light brown jacket there spending time with me and getting to know me. So when I let go, it was the stranger then behind me who reached out and grabbed me and saved my life. I was sent back to the hospital again, I think for a 24-hour hold or something. I didn't really get any. There were no changes to my care. But when I was discharged the next day, I couldn't help but ruminate, is probably the best word for it, on the image of these two men who were with me that night, these two complete strangers who were both watching the exact same situation unfold in front of them, but they had two very different responses to the same circumstance. One chose to be on the sidelines and to shout out and call me a coward and tell me to jump, but then the other guy chose to have my back and to reach out and literally save my life. And I think that was the very first kind of revelation for me. It was the very seed of it where I realized that I got to choose in my life which of those two men I wanted to be like, the one who stood on the sidelines or the one who had people's backs. And when I ultimately chose to be like the stranger who had my back, who saved my life, that's really when things started to spiral upward for me, I think, in very small steps. It wasn't a hallelujah moment by any means.
You met him?
We did. It wasn't until about 10 years later that when I talk about that spiral, that recovery is weird. It takes a long time and there's lots of setbacks and you don't even realize how far you've come until you look back. And that moment didn't come for me until about a dozen years later, when I had this overwhelming urge to find this stranger who by then I talked about in the TED Talk. I pulled all the records and I didn't get anywhere with the records requests. So I went on television, because I'd been doing television and media for more than a decade by that point. I went on Canada AM, which was then, of course, Canada's most watched morning show. I told the story. They showed a clip of the TED Talk. I asked for the public's help on social media, on Twitter and Facebook, to find this stranger who all I knew was that he was wearing a light brown jacket at the time, sometime a dozen years earlier, and he pulled me off a bridge. And within about an hour, people started sending me messages that, this thing went viral all over the world. And then people sent me messages that they knew who I was talking about. One who said that he was his roommate at the time, that he came home and told him about what happened. Another who said he was his brother-in-law, I think, and that they had shared the story in the family for a long time. And apparently, the stranger in the light brown jacket had seen my TED Talk for the first time, in which I talk about him, a week before I went on national television. A week before I went on national TV to look for him, he had already written me a letter in case someday he ever found me. So I don't know if I believe in fate or what, but I've got an awful lot of evidence to support it.
Whether it's, I don't know, whatever you call it, whatever it is, it's meant to be, like, period.
Whatever it is. So he sent me the letter, and he introduced himself. His very first words were, "Hi, Mark, my name is Mike." And when I found out his name, I think that's when it really hit me that he was real. And that if this guy was real, who'd been just a superhero in my mind for all these years, it meant that my story was real too. And that's all that I ever wanted, was to feel seen.
And you said you did meet physically.
We did, yeah. So a few weeks after that, we flew him up to Toronto and put him up in a beautiful suite at the Shangri-La Hotel in downtown Toronto, a 5-star hotel. And the only reason I mention it is because when you tell people a really beautiful story, they just give you a bunch of free stuff. So the Shangri-La was wonderfully supportive in this reunion. Canada AM cameras came along as well. We met in downtown Toronto at Nathan Phillips Square, and Mike walked, when he saw me, he walked directly toward me.
Wow.
And he picked up right where we left off the last time we were together, and he wrapped his arms around me and he hugged me. And I told him that I had no idea how to thank him, not just for saving my life that night all those years ago, but for being my role model, for giving me my whole life ever since. So, the best thing that I could do was to introduce him to the life that he made possible, I introduced him to my wife and to my then 2-year-old little boy, and he's now my second little boy's godfather, and he'll meet my 1-year-old little girl soon. And I talked to him about all the things that I was interested in, all the things I love to do, all my passions, and I got to show him the life that I had built because he happened to be in the right place at the right time, and because he happened to make the decision to reach out, even though he was scared and didn't know what to do. He did it anyway. And he saved my life, and I'll forever be grateful for him for that.
I'm sure that I'm not the first to draw the parallel between this and the movie It's a Wonderful Life, in which Jimmy Stewart was on the side of a bridge thinking to end it all, and an angel came along, and et cetera, and we know that movie.
One of the things that's interesting, though, about that is that for years, for more than a decade, I didn't believe myself. I doubted my own story because I had learned to mistrust my own feelings, and this whole angel devil over my shoulder thing. Like it wasn't until we actually reconnected that I believed my own story, which was extraordinary for me.
And like the movie, you know, I mean, I'm not going to say you had a chance to look back at what life would be like in this world without Mark Henick in it, but this world, because you are still here, is literally a better place. And I know for a fact. Well, no, I know. Okay, you're doing what I was doing before, you Irish Catholic. Sit there and take the compliment. But I know for a fact that in reading testimonials, in watching your TED Talk, in watching some of your appearances, hearing you now, that you have literally changed lives, and dare I say, saved lives. That would not have happened. There would be so many people worse off if you weren't here. And it may not have struck you as that young man standing on that railing that midnight in Sydney, but we forget about everything we've been put on this planet for. And it may not seem like it right now, and it may seem so dark right now, but there's still so much that we can do. And, thank God the man in the brown jacket was there.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I appreciate that. That's been one of the most useful lessons, I think, for me in my life, is that when I encounter, and I only learned this, not just from struggle at the time, but from relapses over the years. It didn't just change overnight, it changed very gradually for me. And I think what that taught me was that when things get hard, I might not know why they're hard. I might not even think that there's any way out of this. But it might sound glib. This too shall pass. Mm-hmm. It's passed before. You've survived 100% of your most difficult days so far. That now, I think, when I encounter struggle, it's not any less hard. I don't deny it. But I can say to myself, I don't know yet how this is going to pan out. I don't know yet what this is going to teach me. Or in terms of my professional life that I've developed because of my struggle, I don't yet know what article I'm going to write about this, or what keynote talk is in this yet, because it's raw material. I think it was, his name is escaping me. He just released a book called Calypso not too long ago, David Sedaris. Mm-hmm. He says this in one of his talks that he does, that he observes the world around him, just notices the world around him. And even if it's really challenging, sometimes even the worst moments in his life, he tries to take a certain detachment and ask himself, what can I do with this? And I think that that's a fundamental mind shift change that's been incredibly helpful for me, that your life isn't happening to you, it's happening for you. And when you make that shift, incredible things happen.
Right. The book is called So-Called Normal, a memoir of family depression and resilience. HarperCollins is a publisher. You can pre-order it through all the usual spots, Amazon and Indigo, or just go to MarkHenick, HENICK.com, and find out more about where Mark may be speaking next and about his book. I appreciate this time, Mark.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been a real pleasure.
By now, you probably realize the first step in preventing suicide is listening and talk. Seems simple enough, but we don't talk about it. Yes, you have to be careful what you say and how you say it, but we still don't talk about it because we're afraid of saying the wrong thing. We're warned about saying the wrong thing. But ironically, not saying anything is the wrong thing. So some advice from experts. Wait until a calm time, then ask someone point blank, are you thinking about suicide? Tell me what's going on. Research shows this will not push someone over the edge. In fact, quite the opposite. Don't try and solve problems. Just listen. Many of those trying to end their lives have said that someone listening to them was all they needed to just step back from the edge. If you have thoughts of killing yourself, it quite often, I am sure, must feel like you're alone and that there is no other choice. Know this. You are important, and there is a need for you in this world. And there are many other choices. Don't carry the weight on your own. Reach out. Start with friends and family, crisis lines, a priest, minister, rabbi. From there, it's so important to look for professional help. And yep, there can be a wait, but you're worth it. You matter more than you realize to many people. Suicide. Silence is no longer an answer. We need to talk about it. Take care of yourself and take care of each other.
Please consider subscribing to this podcast and also check out the Happy Molecule Extra at thehappymolecule.com. There you'll find a link to a video version of this episode, be able to join the conversation about mental health, learn about our Facebook Live show, and get a preview of upcoming episodes. You can email us at thehappymolecule@gmail.com. I'm Erin Davis, wishing you good mental health.